Can anyone comment on the donuts? They're good. Good donuts. Alhamdulillah. We were just talking about collective well-being and then eating donuts. If everyone can, just make sure that you kind of... Is it lava here? Like, why can't anyone sit here? Come. If people come in late, then it's gonna be a bit disruptive for them.
I'm burning.
Okay. So I know that this segment is meant to be called moderated discussion, but the idea is that I have as little to say as possible. And I feel like that will actually be the case today. So I'm going to mostly just let our two speakers go back and forth with each other, address each other's points, any rebuttals or any kind of definitional hashing outs that have to happen. We'll get through that. And then inshallah, as quickly as possible, I'll open up to the floor. Yeah, literally the floor for questions. So without further ado, since you started off, man, we'll probably get to you if there's anything that you'd like to address from within Jane. In particular, introductory remarks in particular, and then you can respond naturally, and then we'll let you bring up a contention or point of your own. I think that's the best way to kind of get things started, inshallah, with this discussion. So, Uthman.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay. There's a couple of things I want to pursue, but I might start with one main one. My sense of James's presentation. So this is what I was looking for. Yeah. Okay. My sense was that he took a very what I might call a bracketed approach or a bracketed philosophy or bracketed approach to the question of the meaning of life. What I mean by that is it's sort of saying, let's just talk about human beings, us, me, you, us, and what makes our lives meaningful. And I say it's bracketed because he's cut out the fact that we are embedded inextricably in a cosmos, and that you simply can't extricate, you can't cut off this from that. So another way to move forward from abstract sort of painting of this, if you go back to my example of the train, what James has done is bracketed the fact that the train hasn't really come from anywhere, that it's on the way to everyone's doom, and he sort of said, let's talk about our time in the train for our, next week, the weeks, the months, or the years that we have, and let's see what sort of things we may do. And said, in this context, meaningful life is about doing productive activities, right? But I feel that's like it's convenient, but it's not really addressing. You can't sort of chop it off and say, okay, everyone, forget the fact that we're all on the way to destruction and nothingness, and let's have a good time while we're here. So that's one thing. The other thing that's related to that is I think James has also smuggled in here some normative content. I say smuggled because he's quite explicitly claiming a naturalist, materialist position. But then within this, and we have to be clear about what that means. That means that what exists in the world is either itself or rests on matter, cold hard matter. Particles, energy. There's no room in that for values. Objective values, objectively, with reference to the human subjects, us, right? So you can't on the one say I'm a materialist and then go, there's two types of values, intrinsic and extrinsic, and there's meaningful life is about doing productive activities. Productive there has a certain normative tinge to it, because it's not just. I'm assuming it's not just economic. It's not just sort of, because otherwise sort of the homicidal maniac will think killing a lot of people is productive. I'm assuming James doesn't mean that. Rather, he means by the fact that it's about well-being, things like this. There's a certain normative content there. But any normative content, any talk of values, on the naturalist view, can only be subjective or intersubjective. And the sort of idea of presenting it objective is a type of smuggling. That's how I said it anyway. But I'll let James to try and maybe clarify that.
Okay, so there are 2 points there. One was about the idea that I didn't, in my remarks, talk about sort of the cosmic or universal perspective. The second point was about the basis or grounding of normativity or value. So let me take the first point first. So I did sort of hint at this at the very beginning when I said, well, I've approached this more from the point of view of answering the question, what makes a life meaningful? In terms of the question about how this fits into the cosmic perspective, I feel like I'm not really sure what that adds to the question. I mean, suppose that I say, well, to live a meaningful life is to, happily contribute to activities that promote things that are objectively good or objectively valuable, which is something like what I said. And then you say, well, yeah, but the universe came from nothing. I'm not really sure how that is a refutation or what that has to do with anything. It just seems to me to be changing the subject. In other words, let me say it differently. We're asking the question about what is the meaning of life or what gives our lives meaning. It seems obvious to me that the answer is going to be related to our lives here on the planet Earth. It's not going to be somewhere in the depths of time and space. That would seem a bit odd. I mean, maybe it could be, but I probably want some reasons for why we would have to go and look billions of years in the past and billions of light years somewhere else in space to answer a question about why our lives are meaningful. And likewise, I'm not really sure why the fact that eventually maybe the universe will contract or there'll be the heat death of the universe, whatever happens, it doesn't seem to change the fact that what we do here and now does have meaning and value in the ways that I described. So I just see those as kind of red herrings. I'm not exactly sure how they relate to the question. And now, so that was the first point. The second point about the sort of grounding or nature of value. So this point I think is quite a substantive disagreement. I'm just going to say that I don't see how it's the case that you can't have objectively valuable, specifically what I'm talking about here is objectively valuable things. I don't see why that's inconsistent with materialism. I probably want to say what's the argument for that, and then we could discuss, well, what are the pros and cons of that? And I guess a way to introduce that might be, well, Uthman, do you think that there's such thing as things that are objectively valuable or intrinsically valuable? And if so, in virtue of what are things objectively or intrinsically valuable? And yeah, I guess I'll ask it that way.
Yeah, also, why is it important to discuss the origin and end of the universe? And why is that relevant to someone living today in terms of finding meaning in their life, as I think was one of your earlier questions?
Well, maybe there's two things we're talking about. Maybe we can stick to one of them and then come back to the second one. So this idea that, it's not clear why cosmic level, let's just call it cosmic level and the local level. One of the terms, right? So this idea that, as long as we can understand why our lives may be meaningful, we don't have to talk about, and I think it's obvious, like, you're asking how is human life meaningful? Obviously, you can take that as saying how an individual human life is meaningful or not, but I just want to speak a bit down when it goes down. Okay, I'm going to stop touching it. We can talk about individual human lives, but I think the question, even if you take it from that angle, is talking about human life generally, right? Because we're all humans, and it's this sort of life that we're talking about how it has meaning. But any subject matter that we study, you can't sort of put an arbitrary line and say, I'm just stopping here. By definition, human life has extensions. It has an origin. It has a destination within whatever worldview that will differ, but it has these connections. You can't just cut them off. And it's like this. Let's take a practical example. Can I say that, I'm going to talk about the meaning of life just today? Don't talk about tomorrow. Don't say anything about tomorrow or next week. Just today, I've done some productive activities, full stop, right? That would be ridiculous, right? If I knew that I'm going to die next week, that makes a huge difference all of a sudden, right? To how I might do things. Obviously, it doesn't change this question, but my point is it makes a huge difference. And so whether you want to look at it as an individual life or how I'm suggesting this is about the question of human life more generally, you can't make these arbitrary cutoffs, right? It's embedded in this reality about where you end up and where you come from. And my point is broader than that. Any subject you study, That's how it's like, so I'm gonna do cosmology, but I'm not gonna go all the way back to the origins. I'm just gonna talk about how the world is now. Can't do that. You could do that as a matter of scope. It's too big a discussion, but if you just cut it off entirely, it's entirely arbitrary. I'm gonna study physics, life, but only these particular lives. It doesn't work that way. There are natural and logical connections that you have to follow. And so when we talk about life has a prior to life, has an after to life, and these connections are all there, and they make a difference. That's the point. They make a difference. What happens to me tomorrow or next week or next month is inextricably tied to how I see myself today. So I don't think you can cut off what I'm calling the cosmic level. And my final point, that would be, I think James is being a little unfair here to throw it off as a red herring. This is not something that I've come up with. I quoted Bertrand Russell, Richard Dawkins, atheists making the exact same point, effectively, that the problem we face, this idea that the fundamental problem of philosophy is suicide, is coming from that angle. They're all saying the same thing. So are you suggesting that all these philosophers are just engaging red herrings? I mean, you can disagree, that's one thing, but it's another thing to say there's a red herring. I can't understand why it's relevant.
So just quickly, I think we'll go to values later. We'll kind of bookmark that and come back because we need to kind of compartmentalize this discussion. And I think that it's almost values are a natural consequence of first establishing these kind of broader cosmic themes. So if you could, just address those points specifically within from Uthman.
Yeah. Okay. So on this, the cosmic significance point. So maybe I'll address the last point mentioned about the what was it, the Bertrand Russell and the Richard Dawkins quote. I mean, so Dawkins is not a philosopher, and I'm not really sure what he means by that pitiless indifference quote. I mostly hear this quoted by theists who seem to like the implications this has for an atheist worldview. But I mean, contrary to popular belief, atheists don't worship at the pulpit of Dawkins, right? I don't have to agree with anything Dawkins says. So when it comes to Bertrand Russell, I do take him a bit more seriously, but I don't really know much about what his specific views are with respect to the meaning of life. And I wasn't saying that what the questions about suicide and other significance, existentialism and other issues that have been discussed are all red herrings. The specific point I was making is that I've advocated for a specific theory about what it might mean for a life to have meaning, and then to say, well, but what about the origin and the end of the universe? I think that is a red herring unless it's made clear what relevance that has to what I've actually said. Now, I certainly agree that obviously it matters, if we're going to die tomorrow or next year, then that would matter to, our lives and the meaning of them, that would lead to a reflection and a refocusing on what we're going to spend our time doing, obviously. But that's not inconsistent with my view. I feel like it's more a question of, so I've articulated, again, the views that I've articulated, and then the objection seems to be raised there, but what about the fact that, I don't know, 1 billion years ago, there were arguably no sentient beings on Earth, or 2 billion years, however far back you go, or maybe, however many 10 billion years in the future, well, we don't know, obviously, there'll be no sentient beings on Earth, again, for the sake of argument. I just don't really know what that has to say about the argument that I'm making. It doesn't seem to address any of the specific points, and that's the sense in which I'm saying it's a red herring. I guess I'm failing to see the force of those responses. I guess I acknowledge other people might find intuitively those questions matter. Again, I'm not saying that the fact that an individual or even humanity as a whole would go extinct, in 60 years or something, or in 10 years, that obviously that would matter to us. But the idea that at some indefinite point, a very long time in the future, there won't be maybe any sentient beings around. I don't know that really just addresses the point. I mean, most people don't spend their lives worrying about this question, that eventually humanity won't be around. I mean, maybe we should, but then I guess I'd ask, why should we worry about that? How does that detract from our meaning now? So I guess I'm failing to see what critical significance the very origin, like the cosmic level, the cosmic origin or cosmic ending has to what we've been discussing, or certainly what I've been advocating for.
Yeah, I accept that no one is confined to any particular author's views, and I agree that I think Dawkins is a bit of I don't use a bad word, and I think Russell, people like Russell are far more formidable. But the point is, I'm not quoting them as some sort of authority. I don't think the authority is particularly not on atheism and theism. I'm using them on a particular premise, which I've substantiated otherwise, but I'm also bringing to show is not something that people from a completely different narrative, in fact, an atheist narrative, can also say a very particular premise, which is that if we study human life within its context, that's not what we're putting it. It's not I think it's a wrong characterization to say why we worry about what's going to happen in a billion years' time. That's not the point. It's the context in which human life is inextricably, necessarily embedded. If you study that without bringing your own meanings, your own values, and your own things to it, on a materialist view, it paints a very bleak picture. Because there is no meaning, there's no point. That's the point Russell's making. That's the point Dawkins makes. That's the point Camus makes. And obviously, there are many others, Rosenberg and whatnot. I'm asking James to address this particular premise, right? Which is a very intuitive premise, right? You've got particles and matter, energy fields floating around, doing the thing, undirected, without any intent, without any sentient being. Things happen in all these contingent ways. We end up, right? Another way of looking at it, we are accidental byproducts. As Russell said, we're accidental byproducts of this undirected process. Why should we worry about anything? All right. So this is where what happens in the future, what matters, because your unintended products, no particular purpose, no particular meaning, and no particular end. All right. And so for me, it's obvious that this is why the question arises: why would you live in the first place on that view, right? And this is why serious philosophers have asked that question, right? And from here we go on to then say, okay, well, since we do need meaning, well, where can it come from? And I accept that you can come up with subjective meanings, and I've shown why they're wrong. Anyway, I think I can't be clearer on why I think the problem is a fundamental one on this topic.
Any final points on the idea of the origins of the cosmos and its relevance that address specifically what Uthman just mentioned?
Yeah, we don't unfortunately seem to be making a lot of progress here. Maybe I'll just try to encapsulate a few final thoughts here. Maybe then we can move on to something else. So I feel like I've given a theory of what it might mean for life to have meaning. A person's life is meaningful to the extent that they positively engage in objectively valuable projects. So I don't think, not this again, I don't think that there's anything about the context, as Uthman said, the context in which you find humans existing in. I don't see what about that context is relevant or in any way sort of refutes that as a plausible theory. I don't see the fact that ultimately everything under a materialist view is, particles moving in fields of force has relevance to that question, because people still exist and still, have things that promote their well-being and detract from their well-being, and that's what's important from the point of view I've advocated for. Deep down, people are made up of particles and force fields, according to my view, but that doesn't, as far as I can see, change the point. Maybe we'll get more to that in a moment. So I don't see anything about the context. I don't see anything about the fact that it's material that's particularly relevant. Some philosophers may disagree with me. Of course, they will. Literally anything I say, some philosophers would disagree with. So I don't think that's a reason to reject the view that I've said it either. So maybe we're just at an impasse at this question, but I'm just not seeing exactly what context is supposed to be sort of refuting the theory that I've offered. Do you want me to follow up with a new question, or? Yeah, because I think it would be good to come back to the theory of value, which we mentioned before. So I did ask a question before. How did I articulate it? It was about so Uthman has argued that that if materialism is true, then nothing can be intrinsically or objectively valuable. And so I guess my two-part question is why think that, and that's the first part. The second part, which is related, is if Uthman, you do believe that some things are objectively or intrinsically valuable, then in virtue of what are they intrinsically valuable? Or what is it that you sort of add to your ontology? That ontology is like the theory of what exists. What is it that you add to your ontology that can make things valuable when just with physical particles that they can't be valuable?
Okay, so in short, sentient being. But the slightly longer answer to that would be that the reason I'm not, let me just speak. Can you hear me like that? No, you can't. Probably not like that. Yeah? Like that? Okay. So the reason you can't have, okay, the key here is the qualification, the qualifier is intrinsic, objective. So I'm not saying you can't have values. You can make up anything you want, right? Because we do have intent, we reason, we have an intellect, we're sentient beings, we have a will. But if we're talking about objective value, and when I say objective, I always mean that in relation to human beings. So human beings are a subject. This is a philosophical term. They're subjective. It's a reference to the subject, the thinking subject, and the object are things in the world that are not that exist independently of my mind, right? So when we talk about objective value and intrinsic value, for me, would be the same thing. It can't come from material substances. So you got a table here, right? What's the value or the meaning of this table? If there was no sentient beings around, so let's take us out of the picture, because anything we do would be subjective value. What's the value of the table? What's its intrinsic value? Right? There's nothing there. Now, obviously, when we come to the picture, we can give a lot of values. We put things on it, we throw it at people who are not happy. It's a smaller table. Depending, you can think of different scenarios, but I don't want to let too much off of my private life. So, I'm joking. You can, yeah, okay. No more examples. So, but you get the point, right? So, subjectively, we can give a lot of values to there, but objectively, it's a particular contingent, accidental arrangement of particles and energy fields. There's no room in that for value. There's no room in that for normativity. There's no room in that objective normativity, and so we have a problem. Now, the other question that James asked was, well, what do you add in your ontology? Well, I don't add, it's kind of build on the materialist ontology, but of course, the major difference here is God, the creator, who is, although considered in philosophical terms an agent, but separate from human beings, not a human being, a creator. And therefore, the will of the creator is what opens up a pathway for all sorts of value, all sorts of normativity, all sorts of meaning, which definitely atheists like to argue that it's still arbitrary in reference to something else. But as I said, my point is, in relation to human beings, it is objective because it's beyond and external to us.
Let's see if I can navigate this intrinsically difficult microphone. Okay, so what is the intrinsic value of a table? Well, obviously there isn't one. I don't know if there are going to be too many people who would say that tables have intrinsic value, and I'm certainly not going to say that. But I think that sentient beings, or the experiences of sentient beings, does have intrinsic value. I showed, well, I didn't actually show because there's no slides, but I mentioned that there are different theories of well-being. So you can talk about the experience, or you can talk about preference satisfaction or objective list theory. I'm just gesturing to that because I'm not necessarily going to commit myself to one very specific view, but just think about well-being or flourishing as a general concept, however you want to package that up. So this exists irrespective of whether you think that God exists or not. I mean, it seems to me that that's just a fact of how humans are, that they can experience well-being, or less well-being, or they can experience a lot of suffering. And I think that it's just sentient beings experiencing high well-being is intrinsically valuable. I think that is a very good candidate for intrinsic value. It doesn't seem that it relies on anything external to that to be valuable, unlike money, as the example I gave, something that has only value with respect to something else. It doesn't appear to me that God makes any difference to that question. Obviously God's can't just sort of disappear, but if you imagine in an impossible world that God just sort of disappeared, it doesn't seem to me that humans would somehow have less value than if they, in the world when God did exist. Similarly, it doesn't seem to me that God would be able to somehow make it the case that humans didn't have, or sentient beings didn't have, that the well-being of sentient beings did not have intrinsic value. Because, I mean, I don't know, God could say that, actually, no, it doesn't have value, but, I mean, it still would, right? It still would be bad to experience pain and suffering, and it still would be good to experience flourishing and happiness and all the other aspects of positive well-being. So I'm just not really sure what God's doing here. And I do think that, I actually will emphasize this point, a naturalist like me doesn't believe in God, and so I assume Uthman does believe that the material universe exists. So we both agree on that, but Uthman believes in God and I don't. So that is something extra in the ontology. And I think that this is important because I think that one of the main benefits of a naturalistic worldview is that it is simpler. We don't have to postulate this being who created the universe and does all sorts of other things depending on your theology. But the point is here, I don't see how postulating God here is necessary to account for anything. It seems that we have everything we need just by looking at the well-being and flourishing of sentient beings, which seems to exist whether you believe in God or not. So well, I guess my question is, what does God add to this picture?
Before that, I just want to press you on a couple of things that I think are very important. So you mentioned the idea of flourishing and well-being a lot. And you said that the sort of naturalist materialist worldview is oftentimes more simplistic, because this comes to the very forefront of what it means, right, to live and what we strive for within a society. It's quite simple, and it's not something that should be that difficult to find. But I often wonder how you personally navigate the inevitable differences in what constitutes flourishing and well-being between two distinct peoples from different sort of groups coming together to form a society. So to give a very crude example, I'm from Western Sydney, you're from Melbourne. If, for example, I said that, it's integral to human flourishing that if someone is behaving very badly, we forcibly remove him and we use violence to teach him that ought not to be the case. And removing people from a certain situation has often, in my experience, led to happier people around, because this person was, say, causing a problem in a particular context, so we had to remove him. Even if you want to use the idea of jail systems versus not having jail systems and alternative forms of punishment, how do you understand? Isn't it just going to be the same kind of ideological fighting and conflict, and then sort of inevitable, unending discussion as to what constitutes flourishing and well-being that would naturally result from a purely naturalistic worldview?
Okay, so just a couple of clarifications before I answer the main question. So when I say that naturalism, I think, is a simpler worldview, I'm referring to sort of, people may be familiar with Occam's razor, that this is the idea that you don't multiple entities beyond necessity, or you prefer a simpler explanation. So I don't mean that it's like simple to understand or simple to live, or that the question, that like the answers are all obvious. I just mean that it doesn't have this extra element in it, the natural world, and that's all. But I mean, that's probably not that important for this particular question here. So, but in terms of the question about, okay, so how do we navigate when people disagree about what will promote human well-being or human flourishing, and which obviously they do. There's a lot of disagreement about this. I don't really have any very insightful answer here, other than that this is just a problem that we face regardless of what your worldview is. So, I mean, some people say that God exists, some people say that he doesn't, some people say that God revealed himself ultimately through Muhammad, some say through Jesus, some deny either of those. There's lots of different views about God. I mean, how do we navigate that? Well, I mean, we try to live in a society where we can get along and express disagreement and have discussions like this, where we can air our views in a productive and friendly way. And we then appeal to arguments and evidences to support our views, and we argue for it, and the person argues back when they disagree. That's how we do it. I mean, I think that applies to the political system, or should apply at least. Obviously, it doesn't always work as well in practice as we would like. So the point is, whatever your worldview is, there are people who are going to disagree with you. And sometimes the answer, you think it's obvious, they don't agree, or no one is really sure what the answer is. You just sort of have to do the best you can. And one thing I would say is that I think that is why events like this are so important, because we really do need to have an open mind and look at what other people think and what other people say to get a proper view about what the alternatives are and why we believe what we believe. It's easy to sort of stay in one's echo chamber and just listen to what other people who agree with you say, but it's important, I think, to see what the multiplicity of views are, to try to best find the best reasons and evidences for the underlying position.
Just a short follow-up question. Does it not bother you that a worldview or an idea of flourishing and well-being that you find abhorrent or you disagree with may triumph over your own perception? Do you understand what I'm asking, sort of?
I'm not sure, but I mean, that's surely a concern for all of us, right? So, I mean, I suppose that I'm not exactly sure what Islam says about this, but I know that in Christian circles there's an idea that, there's going to be a second coming of Jesus, and Christianity is going to eventually sort of triumph everywhere. So, I mean, obviously as an atheist and naturalist, I don't have that view. There's no sort of guarantee that history is going to end up the way we'd like. I do tend to believe that the truth will out eventually, but that's a complicated question, so I don't really want to get into that here about why I think that. But to answer your question directly, it doesn't worry me that much. It does sometimes. So there are certain issues where misinformation or out and out lies or pseudoscientific beliefs or harmful views seem to be gaining prominence in some areas, and that is worrying. And that's why I think that we need to promote the antidote to that is, good scientific views and well thought out positions and genuine productive engagement and exposing lies and things like that. I think, well, I guess this becomes more of a sociological question, but I think that we're on a generally good trajectory the last few hundred years. Things are a lot better than they used to be. That's not a debate about that, so I know people disagree with that, but I'm optimistic. So I'm a humanist, which is a position about the basis of human value, and I've sort of advocated for that this evening. But humanists are generally optimistic. They think that through the application of reason and compassion and things that we can build a better future. So I don't worry too much about that. I do worry about it a little bit. So yeah, I guess that's how I think about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I was waiting for the throwing table solution to dealing with diversity, but it never came. I'm joking. Okay. I want to get back to the question and sort of, I guess, one of the basic premises that James is putting forth here about how he sort of gets normativity or values in a materialist universe. But to be honest, all I can see there is an assertion. He's asserting here that, well, we experience well-being, we experience suffering, and well-being is valuable, and obviously suffering is invaluable, or it's something we want, and therefore we have value. Ta-da! Right? So what are you talking about? And I feel like this is just it's an assertion, but the problem with it is you're moving from a description of events, of how things happen and how we may think about them, how I feel about them, to make it a normative assertion. So you're jumping from description to prescription, in the sense that, let's take an example. If, I don't know, Raphael punches someone here and the person suffers. Sorry, violent example. And the person suffers, we'll say, well, this is suffering, right? But what I'm pointing at is, it's one thing for me to describe and say, Raphael punched so-and-so, the guy felt pain, he fell down. When I go and say that was bad, intrinsically bad, I'm not describing anymore. I'm not in a description. I'm now in the name of normativity. And you can't just bring that out from nowhere, right? And you can contrast this and see. And now the reason most of us accept that is because that's how we're conditioned. And I would argue a lot of the well-being, flourishing, and the moral values and the normative values, even in the West, forget Muslim world or the Islamic context, even in the West, are remnants of a Christian worldview, right? So sort of the good bits that you keep, and the bad bits you sort of chuck out, right? And secularism and the rest of it. But the point should be clear. It's one thing to describe an event, and another thing to say this is bad. When you say this is bad, you're saying something else that's not in what actually took place, right? And it necessarily depends on on something else. That's not got nothing to do with the whole incident. So, for example, if I say him punching you was bad, I say something like, well, because you suffered. There's an initial premise there. Suffering is bad. That's not a descriptive premise. You can't prove that by pointing to certain particles, energy fields, or anything in the materialist world. That's an insertion into the materialist world from something that's not material. Right? So either you made it up, or we sat down and thought about things and we made it up, right? But it's not there in and of itself. And I think that this is sort of where what I'm referring to as the smuggling is happening, where you're just saying, well, this is what happened and this is how we feel about it. This is what we say, this is how we speak. But that's sort of a phenomenological analysis, a description. It's smuggling these normative premises. And one final point about how we can see these things happen in the natural world, in the animal kingdom, the same sort of thing would not be referred to as bad. Where a particular animal, not punches, but, causes suffering to another animal, and we just say that's normal. In the sense that politically or socially, we wouldn't try to stop that, right? And this goes back to the fact that there's all this contingency here. Charles Darwin wrote in The Descent of Man that had human beings had the evolutionary process happen to man in the context of what happens to hive bees, right, a completely different species, we would have ended up with our, I forget the specific examples, but with things like fratricide, where the female bees will kill their sisters or their daughters, but they will do things that we consider to be suffering and evil, but not in the animal kingdom. But what's the difference? You're inserting something that you can't bring out purely out of matter.
Yeah, so I thought this topic would be fruitful in terms of at least bringing out some of the underlying disagreement. So I've been accused of just making assertions, and I mean, in a sense, that's true. And let me clarify about what I mean in a sense, because I haven't given a deductive argument for why I think that that theory of value is correct. I'm appealing to that as a theory of value. I think I've given some gestures at reasons why I think that's plausible. In terms of, I think it fits well with moral discourse and how we tend to use the term, and it seems like there is a real phenomenon there of human well-being. So it's I feel like the objection was, although this wasn't quite described in this, it's sort of the ought from it is fallacy that David Hume mentioned. And the specific point that he meant there is if you start with a bunch of premises about the way something is, and you end up with a conclusion about the way it ought to be, then you've committed a fallacy because you have to have some way of sort of deriving that ought from the is. Now, I haven't directly been talking about ought claims. I want to make that clear because that's a slightly different question. I haven't said anything about normativity. That's about right and wrong. I'm talking about value. Those are distinct, although of course they do relate to each other. But in terms of value, so the issue here is what we need to understand is when we're giving a theory about the nature of value, what we do is we construct a theory or develop a theory, and then we analyze the theory. We say, okay, so what is its explanatory power? How plausible is it? How coherent is it? And so forth. So when I say that something like it is the well-being of sentient beings is intrinsically valuable, that is not just the premise that I'm asserting. That's a conclusion on the basis of the theory that I'm advocating for. And the point is that's all we can do, right? Because if I'm told, for example, well, no, the reason that humans have intrinsic value is because, I don't know, God says so, well, that's just an assertion as well. You'd have to say, well, how do you get to that conclusion? And it's just going to be, well, here's a theory of value that relates to God in some way, or his commands or nature or whatever it is. We haven't really heard one this evening, which I think is disappointing because we need to be able to compare two theories, right? And then we say, okay, so here's one theory of value based on God in some way. Here's a theory of value based on that doesn't include God. And what's the more plausible theory? I think that theories of value that are necessarily relate to God, his commands or nature or something else, or his purposes for us, I don't think they fare very well. I think they're quite implausible. I don't think they fit very well with our discourse, and I think that they involve various contradictions. I don't really want to get into those because I don't want to argue against a straw man, right? So I'm not exactly sure what Uthman thinks about this, but I guess the point is it's very easy to say, oh yeah, well, why think that? Why think that? And you can keep asking the question till the cows come home, right? But the point is I'm advocating for a theory of intrinsic value, which I think is plausible, and I've given some gestures at reasons for. That's not directly the topic of the debate, so I don't want to get into too much detail there, but I think there's a baseline plausibility there at least. It does seem to fit with how we think about these sorts of things. And I don't feel like that there's any alternative theory being presented there. So unless we just want to say that nothing has intrinsic moral value and we should just all be nihilists, then I think that at this point I'm in the better position of having a plausible theory against nothing.
Yeah. Okay, I think I have, in between the lines, presented a theory. Again, I'm not coming from, I think part of it is about meaning, what it means, how it has purpose to it. But, and the only reason I've avoided going into the content of the meaning of any worldviews, because that's not the topic. The topic is life meaningful? It's not, what is the meaning of life? Right? And so I'm trying to, as I said, come from an angle of coherence. So, but otherwise, I have presented two approaches, both of which can be critiqued. So I'm saying, on the one hand, you got the view that a powerful, wise, sentient being, external to human beings, is the grounds for meaning and value. Right? And you can critique that all you like. But my point is, and I'm not substantiating that because that's not the topic, and therefore I'm not even asking James to substantiate some of the terms, but we're looking at coherence. Right? Is it coherent to say what I've just said? I think absolutely it is. I'm happy to hear from James who thinks it isn't. On the other hand, we've got a worldview that sort of says the only thing that exists to matter, right? But somehow we get value. In that, somehow we get normativity, and I don't accept this idea that somehow value is so different from normativity. Right? Because when you say things like we experience well-being and that's valuable, right? What are you saying? You're saying that that's a normative claim. You're saying that suffering ought to be avoided, right? Flourishing ought to be maximized. These are normative claims, right? So whether you want to call it normative or value is not the point. But so this is how I'm looking at this. The two worldviews. One has a ground for objective meaning and objective purposivity or meaning or values, and the other, in my assertion, my contention, doesn't have room for that, but it's smuggling it in because there's no other way we can live. And this ties into the other point that James just made, which is that he keeps sort of saying that this seems to make sense based on how we do things, how we understand things, how we talk about things. But the way we do things and the way we talk about things, that's a subject of assessment, a subject of critique. It's not we take that as a given and then work off that. I can explain that as well. I've said before at the start that this is not about atheists or any human beings. I'm not saying human beings can't live meaningful lives. That's not the argument. They can live meaningful lives, right? The argument is about a particular worldview and whether it provides for an adequate ground of such meaning or not, right? But you can, even an atheist or a naturalist can live a meaningful life. It's just that they'd be doing so despite their atheism, not because of it. So this is how I would frame very much two approaches to the topic and two assertions, both of which I think can be critiqued.
I don't think it's satisfying. It's satisfactory to say, well, God gives. That's all there is to say about it. We need a theory about that. Suppose God created us, and His only purpose in creating us was to be Sisyphus, pushing rocks uphill and then having them roll down again. Suppose that He did that. Would that be a meaningful life? I contend that it wouldn't be. Even if God did create us to do that, it would be a meaningless life. It would be a pointless task. And so it's all about the question of, well, what is God created us to do, and is that a meaningful thing for us to do? Do we find meaning in that? How do we find meaning in that? I just don't accept that you can just assert, oh, well, God takes care of this and we don't have to address any questions about that. But then I need to provide a theory not only of that, but also of the basis of value. I think that's a clear double standard here. Also, I want to make an important point. When I talk about, well, this is how we use the term value, that's absolutely relevant, okay? If you're going to ask a question, or if anyone's going to ask a question, what is intrinsically valuable? Obviously, I have to start with, well, what do you mean valuable, right? Otherwise, how do I even know what you're talking about? So a starting point is, well, how do we use the term valuable? When do we say something's valuable and when do we say it's not? And also particularly when do we say something is intrinsically valuable? You can't explain or give a theory about a word without taking into consideration how the word is used. Suppose I said, well, something is intrinsically valuable if and only if it is orange. And say, well, that's a dumb theory of intrinsic value. Well, that's got nothing to do with whether something's intrinsically valuable. No one says that something's valuable because it's orange. Like, come on, that's silly. But I could just say, well, that's how I'm using the word, so that's what it is. But then I seem to have just misunderstood what the intrinsic value means. Like, I don't actually know what the word means. Obviously, we have to, so the point I'm making there is obviously we have to start with how we use terms, because otherwise, what are we even talking about? These questions are always semantic linguistic in nature. So obviously I'm going to start with, well, let's see how we employ or deploy the term valuable, specifically intrinsic value, and then see if we can construct a theory that matches that. Now, a theory should also be coherent with other things we believe. It should refer to things that exist in reality. So if my theory required me to posit things that I don't think exist, well, then it's not a good theory, right? But this is, I think, how we evaluate theories philosophically. You start with, what are we talking about? And then you construct a theory that explains how that works with respect to what we're talking about. And then you see if that coheres well with itself, fits with other beliefs, is plausible, refers to entities that exist, and so on and so forth. So I think I've done that, at least in broad sketches. And I don't think Uthman has done that. He's just said, oh, well, God exists and gives life meaning without explaining how or why. And I think I've given a counterexample to how God could still exist and create the universe, but life could be meaningless, it seems. At least the meaning wouldn't derive from God if we were just all Sisyphus. So I would ask, well, would life be meaningful if God... let me rephrase that. Uthman, do you think that God could make our life meaningful in an arbitrary way, like by telling us to be Sisyphus?
Yeah, I think that's a good question to sort of show where the difference here may be. The idea that we could judge that as meaningful or otherwise presupposes that we have some external criteria, both to God and ourselves, since we're looking for objective meaning, by which we can sit there and say it is meaningful or it isn't, right? So James here said, if in this hypothetical sort of caricatured, cartoonish world, if God made us to do something futile, right? As soon as you say that, you're already assuming that there's some criteria by which we're judging it to be futile. What is it? What is that? And what is it outside of something subjective, right? And I could rephrase the question differently. When James keeps saying intrinsic value, what makes that value intrinsic? what makes it objective, right? Now, I've got nothing wrong with referring to the way we speak about words. I agree with what James said there. To take into consideration the way we speak as a starting point, but that's not what I see him doing. He's also using that as a criteria to judge. And so here's my theory, it makes sense. And I don't need to answer any further questions about how you come up with value in a purely materialistic universe or normativity. How do you come in the way that he characterized it, which is another equally a good characterization. How do you get an is from an alt? How do you get an alt from an is? Sorry. So maybe I'll put this question to James, not this last one. You can try your hand at that one as well. But what is it that you're referring to? First of all, in the God example, the hypothetical, by what criteria would you say it's meaningful or meaningless? And related to that, what is it that makes these values intrinsic, that you keep referring to as intrinsic values?
So with respect to what criteria would I use, I mean, I think hopefully people who've been paying attention knows exactly what criteria I'm going to use to say that the God Sisyphus example, that's meaningless. It's the criteria that task, well, first of all, it's hard to see how we could be positively engaged in that task, but maybe we could somehow. So the subjective element would be missing, but also the objective element would be missing because it would be a pointless task. It wouldn't help to contribute to something that's intrinsically meaningful, intrinsically valuable, namely the flourishing of sentient beings. So I think even if God somehow did tell us to do that, it still wouldn't be meaningful because it wouldn't be a task that would contribute to the flourishing of sentient beings. Now, maybe God could somehow make a Sisyphus race of people who actually did experience well-being just by pushing rocks up slopes. I mean, this is a pretty bizarre situation here, but the point is, as a naturalist, I'm going to say that human well-being is contingent on the way humans are, and this actually harkens to a point Uthman mentioned before about, well, if we were bees, then things would be very different. But well, yes, if we were bees, then our well-being would be different. Then we'd have bee-type well-being. But we're not bees, we're humans, and so it's a human-based well-being for humans, obviously, and other animals have their own types of well-being. And I don't think there's a lot of overlap there because we all, the pain and suffering is sort of similar, but there are going to be differences for different species. So I'm comfortable with that the way that the form of well-being that we focus on is the form that we actually have as humans, and that is the objective standard that we look to. I want to make a point about objectivity here because just because something is contingent on the way human beings are doesn't mean that it's subjective. Subjective means that a proposition is subjective if it doesn't have a truth value independent of the person making the judgment. So if you say like ice cream is delicious, many people would say that that's a subjective claim because it depends on who's making the claim as to whether it's true or false, right? There's no objective truth to the matter about whether ice cream is delicious. Again, plausibly, some would actually disagree with that. But then when we address the question, what is it that makes what are the things that promote well-being in people, or at least what are some of the general factors? I don't think that is a subjective question. There's an objective answer to that. It doesn't depend on who's making the judgment. Now, of course, there are some things that vary from person to person, but there are some universals, and it doesn't matter. If I hit someone and that person experiences suffering, it doesn't matter if I make a judgment about whether that person is experiencing suffering or that person does or someone else does. There's a right or wrong answer about whether they've experienced suffering. So it's objective in that sense. Yes, it depends on human beings, but that doesn't make it subjective any more than saying humans have two arms is a subjective claim because it depends on humans. So that's the standard that I'm appealing to. It's a standard about human well-being. And I just very briefly relate that to the second question that Uthman asked. Where does intrinsic goodness come from? And it comes from the facts about human well-being, or more generally, the well-being of sentient creatures. Why? Well, I think you give a theory about what value is, and then you defend that theory, and that's what I'm trying to do here. You can ask why until the cows come home, but at the end of the day, all you've got is, here's my theory, here are my reasons for it, let's listen to your theory, let's hear your reasons for it. And I'm still waiting to hear a theory of value from Uthman, where he thinks value comes from.
Before that, though, I think all of this rests upon one fundamental point, which is, what is well-being? How do you objectively determine well-being? Suffering, you say you believe is objective, but how is well-being objective?
So I did mention this briefly before, and this is like a whole other debate, because we're originally talking about meaning, and then I'm linking meaning to value because I think that objective value matters to meaning. It's not the same thing as the way I've said, but then you have to think about, well, okay, so because I'm a welfarer, so I think that value is grounded in human well-being. Well, then what is that? So you've got to follow the steps here. I mentioned three main views about this. So hedonism, which says that basically, I mean, that has a negative connotation, but here it just means that it's like your subjective experience, whether you're experiencing pleasure or pain or happiness or sadness, something like that. That's ultimately the ground of well-being. Another view is preference satisfaction, so basically like getting what you want. Now you can understand that in an abstracted form, so it's not getting whatever you want right now. It's like what you would want if you knew everything and were able to consider all of the relevant factors. So it's a sort of an idealized preference view. And there's a third view called objective list theory, which says, well, there's a list of objective things based on the nature of human beings such that you need all of these things to have well-being. I'm not really taking a strong stand about those views. They're something that people can look into. I lean towards preference satisfaction views myself, but I don't think that's critical to anything I'm saying this evening. I think the point about these views is that they don't make any necessary reference to anything outside of human beings. It's just how do you figure out what it is for humans to experience flourishing and well-being? Well, you look at humans, you look at how they live, you look at their lives, and you evaluate things that contribute to well-being and those that don't. I mean, I think it's just like how we answer any other question. You sort of look at, well, what are we dealing with, and what are the facts of the matter, and you try and work it out. I mean, I don't think that there's any sort of, obviously it's a hard question. I'm not saying, oh, it's easy, you just follow these three simple steps. Human well-being is complicated, but I think we do know a lot about human well-being, and we know many things that improve it and many things that detract from it. And so I think it acts as quite a plausible candidate for a basis of intrinsic value. And as I keep pointing out, we haven't heard any alternative theory this evening.
I'm now worried about James's hearing abilities. I've said at least 3 or 4 times. I'm not confined to give a theory of value, because I'm not taking that route. But on meaning and purpose, I've clearly said that God, as a sentient being, as a wise and powerful being, provides the ground for objective meaning. Now, but coming to the point that James is making, I think everyone who's listening carefully, his entire thesis boils down to a assertion or a premise which is tied to this idea of human flourishing and well-being. It's like, how is it objective? Well, flourishing and well-being. What makes these values intrinsic? Oh, flourishing and well-being, right? So, but that's my point. That assertion is a pure assertion, and it's not a descriptive one. That's my point, which is why examples like 2 arms it's a category mistake to do an analogy with that. Because I can look at anyone's 2 arms and know there's 2 arms. It's a description, right? But when you make a claim about what ought to happen, that's not a description. It's not an empirical science. It's not something you do an experiment on. We're in ethics. We're in the realm of ethics and morality, which necessarily depends on some framework. There's some moral framework, utilitarianism, Kantian morality, command theory, however you want to look at these. And so, I think the problem with James' thesis is very, very clear. He's tying certain claims about objective value, intrinsic value, and whatnot to this idea of human flourishing and well-being, but that premise is just plucked out of the blue. And really, if we ask where does it come from, which is not really answering, is that human beings have come up with it in a materialist framework, in the framework of no God, in a theist framework. We say, well, God says that I've created you for human flourishing, for example, right? You have a basis. Obviously, that's not the end of it all. A person would have to prove the existence of God, see whether it's coherent, problem available. Well, there's a lot of things. From where we're focusing on, that's a coherent thesis. But on the other hand, to just say there's no God, there's only material matter, there's only matter, but then our guiding light is human flourishing. Where did you come up with that from? Clearly, either you come up with it yourself or we've come up with it ourselves, and it's not clearly because human beings disagree. We just agree that there's vast disagreement. There's no consensus on anything, right? And so it's some human beings have come up with this idea that flourishing is good. It's something that we need to work for and whatnot. I would argue that most people agree with that, except that some of those people have an objective ground, and some of them do not, but they're still insisting on it, and that's why I've referred to it as smuggling it in.
I think after you respond to this, James, you can also tie in some concluding remarks, and then I'll open up some questions to the floor.
Okay, I don't want to repeat myself too much. I think I want to push back most strongly on this idea that you can't make that judgments of well-being are not descriptive judgments, because I think they absolutely are. So I'm just going to pose a simple question. If I torture a child, Can you make a descriptive evaluation about the well-being of that child? There you go. We agree.
No, that's the initial premise. I think that's the initial premise that the decrease in well-being caused by that torture is bad, and that's not descriptive.
Yeah, but that's different to the point you made. So the point I was making is it's important to pay attention to the logic here. So facts about human well-being or sentient well-being are descriptive statements, okay? So that's one point we've agreed on that. Now, there's a second point. Is that the basis of value? Okay, that is a separate point. I agree with that. How do I know that that is the basis of value? You give a theory of value. What else could you possibly do? Uthman is saying, no, the basis of value is something to do with God. Well, how do you know that? Well, he gives a theory of value, except he hasn't done that because he says he doesn't have to, but for some reason I do. You give a theory. And then you say, well, how good is the theory? You assess it on planetary virtues. It's not like I can prove it deductively, like I'll just put up a bunch of logical symbols and then, oh, bam, he's proved this. No, it doesn't work like that in philosophy. You only get out of your premises what you put into them. You advocate for a theory and you give the reasons for and against it. This is how science works as well, and I think philosophy is contiguous with science. So I don't see what the issue is. To provide evidence against what I've said or reasons against what I've said, we'd have to identify problems with what I've said, not just ask, but why I think value is related to well-being. Well, because that's the theory I'm advocating for. That's what we're addressing here. What's the alternative? Where does value come from? I don't think satisfactory to say, oh, it comes from God. How? Why? What is it that God does that makes it human well-being more valuable than just human well-being by itself? Actually, I'll put that as a question. What is it that God does or says that makes the human well-being valuable when it wouldn't be valuable just by itself?
Okay, there's a problem with the way you're framing this now. When we've got two different worldviews, two different theories, two different frameworks, it's not helpful to jump from a critique of one to the other one. That's just convenient. Because I asked you a question about what you're saying. Oh, but you haven't done this. I need to prove the coherence, first of all, and again, you're also confusing coherence and substantiation. I haven't asked for evidence. I'm not even at that stage yet. I'm just asking for a coherent theory. All right? If the theory that I put forth, I should be able to defend it against charges of incoherence or lack of evidence, right? On the other hand, the theory you put forth, you should be able to show its coherence and evidence. If we're talking about, I think today we haven't got to the point of evidence anyway. It's mainly been around coherence. So, but this idea that you jump from one and because you can't answer the question I put to you, you push it back to me on my theory, what does God add to? There's no link between the two frameworks. They're completely different. We don't jump from one to the other one. If we add God onto a naturalist framework, what does he add? We're not doing that. Let's put it that way. It's a completely different way of looking at things. And all I'm arguing is, at base, I put forth a coherent understanding of the meaningfulness of life. A theory or a framework in which it makes sense that life is meaningful, right? There's a God, a creator, he created human beings, there's a purpose, whether we look at it in terms of the end, the origins, it's coherent. We're not talking about whether it's right or wrong, right? Because we could talk about whether it's right or wrong. That would go back to the question, does God exist? It's a different topic, right? But it's coherent and it makes sense in that sense that it's coherent, right? On the other hand, as I said, I don't know how else to put this. When James is saying that he can't explain where he got the quote, where he got the premise of flourishing being good, well-being being good from, because it's a theory. It's just a roundabout way of saying I'm asserting this. Fine, but I'm coming back at your assertion to say it does not cohere. It doesn't make sense. So I'm asking for evidence to prove. I'm asking for to explain how you've come up from pure description to a normative assertion. But anyway, I think we've gone enough back and forth on this, so we can open up to the floor.
If you could just sort of like briefly and succinctly and perhaps summarize, what you'd like everyone to take home, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Okay, sure. So I've advocated for a theory of meaning based on Susan Wolf's theory, in which to live a meaningful life is to positively engage in projects that have that result in objectively valuable results. I think that's a plausible theory. I think the way we need to advocate and assess philosophical theories is to look at their coherence, to look for their fit in terms of, does it make sense with how we use the concept? Does it make sense with other things that we believe? Do the entities or postulates made by the theory sort of fit with our beliefs about what exists? And I think that that's all the case. That those are well met by the theory that I've advocated. In contrast, Uthman has, I think, mostly refused to present a theory. He has said that God provides meaning and value, and that's basically all he said. I have been listening hard to try to get more structure to it than that. Now, the thing is that I haven't disproved what he said there, because it's a bit hard to respond when one doesn't have much to work with. What I would say is that I don't think that there's an incoherence in what I've argued, because I mean, I could just assert it's just my view that humans well-being has intrinsic value, and that's all there is to it. Okay, there's nothing incoherent about that. Maybe I haven't substantiated it. I mean, I think I have, but suppose that I haven't. That's not the same as it being incoherent. Uthman can say, well, God provides value and meaning, and I can say human well-being provides value and meaning. Those are both coherent. I don't see any contradictions in either of those, at least at that level, right? And we could just leave saying, well, I believe mine, and he believes his. And I think the whole point, and this is what actually kind of upset me about what Uthman said when he was saying that, well, you can't just jump from one theory to another theory. But why are we here if we can't compare our worldviews? Isn't that the whole point of why we're here this evening? To say, well, here's what I think, let's hear what you think, let's compare and weigh them up against each other. If it's all just attack what I think and not actually share what you think, then, I mean, I think I've left the poorer, because I actually wanted to know, Uthman, what you think about the nature of value and meaning. And all I've heard is what I could have guessed coming in, that, well, God provides it. So I'm a bit actually disappointed by that. I think I've at least tried to give more of a substantive, descriptive, explanatory theory about how these things fit together. Hopefully you found that interesting, and I look forward to your questions about it.
Okay, so without further ado, I will open up questions to. Right at the back.
Right. Good day. James Uthman, thank you very much for the presentation. And the sisters hear me? Right. Rana? Okay. James, you mentioned that the Sisyphean life would be meaningless because there's no point to it beyond long the border up the hill, right? Yep. How does a flourishing life that is finite have any more meaning than an eternity along the border up the hill? It seems that your position collapses into the Sisyphean issue that you yourself didn't accept as being a plausible way of being, even if God were to determine us to be living that lifestyle. If anything, the long the border up the hill has more meaning because it goes on forever. Right? So the point is keeping going. Whereas the one that you're talking about, you flourish, but it ends. Right. Yeah, that's my first question. If I have time to ask more then. Thank you.
I'll try and keep the answers brief to fit in as many questions as possible. So I'll actually stop you at 2 minutes.
Oh, I don't want to take that long. So how can it be meaningful? How can a life be meaningful if it ends, and isn't the Sisyphean life meaningful because it continues? I don't think it matters how, well, it does matter, but it's not like the only important thing is how long something goes. I mean, if you're being tortured forever, I don't think that's a meaningful life, even if it goes forever, right? Well, no, what matters is your well-being and well-being of other people during the period, and that counts, right? It's not like the value just goes to zero because it ends. So obviously there's a longer discussion to be had there, but my view is that it's not just about how long it goes for, it also matters what happens while it's around.
Okay. The gentleman here.
I have a question for Atheist. So you mentioned so you mentioned meaning is when people positively engage in an objective, valuable subject. So what makes a subject objectively valuable when human judgment is subjective? And you actually proved it just now because you said torturing has no meaning, but actually how did you get that judgment from? So because in Islam, judgment is objective and we follow the Quran. So that is where we get our judgment from. But you plug in from different philosophers and theorists and you don't have a fixed objective judgment. So where do you get your judgment from?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think there's a few, I mean, my judgment is subjective, right? Anyone's individual judgment is subjective because it's subject dependent. But that doesn't mean that we can't hold objectively true beliefs, right? So
where does your objectivity come from is my question.
Okay, yeah, so that's...
Belief is subjective.
Yeah, so but beliefs are always subjective because they have to be subject to believe them. But the thing being believed can be objectively true. So where does objective truth come from? Well, it comes from the states of affairs and what they're like. So, I mean, to take a simple example, there's a table in front of us, right? So I have a belief that there's a table in front of us. That's subjective because I hold that belief as a subject. Yeah, maybe a description, but I'm just using that to answer the question about objectivity here. So, but the fact, in what sense can I say that it is objectively true that there's a table here? Well, because there's a table here. If I believed that there wasn't a table here, well, that would also be a subjective view, but it would be false because there is a table here. So I'm not I mean, I feel like we could discuss that for about 3 hours, digging into your objection there. But I mean, the simplest point is that whether our beliefs are true or not depends on the states of affairs that exist in the world. Beliefs about those states of affairs are always subjective because the subject has to hold them. But it's the states of affairs and whether they exist or not and what they're like that determine whether they're true or not. And states of affairs can exist outside of minds. You know, the table exists here whether I see it or not. So that's objective.
So you're literally saying that it's subjective, but you're just saying it as objective. I've answered my question.
The sister at the back.
That's good. I mean, in fact, I touched upon this a little bit in terms of, you know, Albert Camus's point. In fact, his entire philosophy is based on what the things that we're hearing. So, but there are people who think he wasn't a very good philosopher. That's a different point. But yeah, I hear that question as one of, I mean, it depends. It's not so much about, or let me frame it this way. It's more a question of how we read reality first and then decide on how to act with it, as opposed to sort of, you know, why can't we do this or why can't we do that? And this is where the problem comes from. This is where the question arises from. When we read our reality on a certain view, you know, in a godless world, it's all matter. We don't come from anywhere, not going anywhere. We're like on that train. And so like, an obvious question arises, right? And one of those questions is, what's the point of living? If you want to die anyway, after, and the reality of most lives is they can be quite difficult, even apart from, you know, whether you're living in difficult sort of socioeconomic circumstances. Otherwise, life is generally tough. All right, so why bother? Now, the sort of subjectivist answer is, well, there's also good, there's meaning, there's kids, and you have this, and relationships, and doing the rest of it, right? But the question, at least, or I think the question should be obvious. Serious thinkers, philosophers, and others have asked this question. And the difference, to get to your question, the difference is that, and in fact, I read, when I was doing my research on this, I read that according to some scholars, asking this question in this way about the meaningfulness of life is actually a modern phenomenon. It's about 250 years old, and I think a particular author was saying, Novelas, the Enlightenment, French thinker, first put it in these terms. It's not to say people didn't have similar questions before, but they were very different. They were more about suffering, right? They were about suffering. Why do we suffer so much? How things are difficult? But it wasn't a coherence issue because it was about suffering, and people generally in religious or theological worldviews would understand the role of suffering. And so the question was about understanding the role of suffering in a world created by God. But the problem here becomes there is no God. There's nothing. It's just empty darkness. It's pitiless indifference. In the words of Dawkins, right? So why live? The question is there, and that because difference becomes in the context of a benevolent God, where you can understand a particular purpose, where you can understand a particular trajectory, where you can understand accountability, where you can understand, you know, where you're going to end up. It makes sense, and at least it provides clear and objective meaning, which you can ground your life. Doesn't get rid of suffering, doesn't get rid of the difficulty. But it's about understanding the place of that. When you can understand the place of that, you know why you're living this meaning. You know why you're living, purpose, value, and you do it. On the other hand, of course, I think, yeah, as I said, most atheists end up on the same sort of thing, on the same sort of idea of how to live life. And you got to deal with suffering, and you got to do your best and enjoy the good things, and the rest of it. But it's just that on the view itself, you can't substantiate that. It's not coherent on the view itself, and you're smuggling in things in order to to make it so.
I feel like you're going to explode if I don't take you
Thank
there.
you.
So.
I have two parts to my question. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. So the first part is talking about what you mentioned with your objective values. Yeah. Your objective values, or from what I can tell, stem from the modern liberal values. They're from the theory of liberalism that come from the philosopher John Locke. Yeah. John Locke says that anything that increases the pleasure, so the pleasure harm principle, anything that increases the pleasure in a society should be done. And that is where, from as far as I can tell, your objective moral values come from. Now, what my reply to that, and my question will be, is that a group objective is not what we're talking about. A group objective value. What we're talking about is a intrinsic objective value. This the intrinsic value that we're trying to look for comes from a place that has no subjectivity whatsoever. A group objective is still technically subjective because different groups have different objective values. If that's what your criteria for an objective value is, but if your objective value comes from, let's just say, a philosopher who says that the pleasure principle is what should be the top, then it's not really objective. It's still subjective. And just to add to that this is the second part. I don't know if you've heard of Kierkegaard, yeah, Soren Kierkegaard. He says that there's three stages of life. The first is aesthetic, where you'll want to increase your pleasure, which is what I believe you're trying to, not preach, but you know what I'm saying. The second part is the ethics values, and the third part is the religious values, which you will eventually reach once you go through the three stages. Yeah. So inshallah. so what I'm trying to say here is, what will be your leap from the aesthetic value to the ethic value? At what point do you think that the pleasure values change from being just pure pleasure to then being ethics and morality? What's the jump here?
I'm not sure I accept the premise of the question, because I don't have to agree with Kierkegaard. I think Kierkegaard was a great philosopher. I don't have to agree with him on that particular point. With respect to, I do think of myself as adhering to broadly sort of a liberal tradition, although I do want to say I have not advocated for a pleasure principle. This evening, I did carefully say that there are multiple views about what it is for a life to be, for humans to live a flourishing life, or theories of well-being. So pleasure pain is one of those. I actually lean towards a preference satisfaction view, which we could talk about another time. Although I think that there's different, that each view has its own plausibilities. But broadly, I don't think life is just about experiencing pleasure. For a start, I've given it advanced theory of meaning, where to live a meaningful life is to do things, to engage, joyfully in projects which produce things that are objectively valuable. And that's not just pleasure for yourself; it's also good things for other people. And that, I think, is what's important in life.
Yeah, but to who is it objectively valuable?
Oh, yeah, that was the other part of your question about the notion of subjectivity. So I think that the idea that a theory of value should have no subjectivity in it at all is very implausible, because that would be somehow saying that the fact that humans experience things, or other animals as well, is in no way related to questions of value, which seems extremely implausible to me. Even if God is in the picture, surely he's going to recognize the fact that the experience of human beings and animals and so forth does have value. So the sense in which it's not subjective is that the truth of propositions about well-being is not dependent upon the person making the judgment. That's the sense in which it's not subjective. So if there's a baby who's experiencing pain, I might say, oh no, they're not experiencing pain, and they just do that, they just cry. Then, assuming that it is experiencing pain, I would be wrong about that, right? So it's not dependent upon the person making the judgment. There's an objective fact of the matter. Now, the objective fact of the matter relates to a fact that relates to an experiencing entity, a subject. But that's just the same sense in which we could say that I'm thinking about the color orange, right? That relates to a subject, which is me. I'm the one thinking about it. But it's an objective fact that I'm thinking about it. You don't want to say that it's somehow completely subjective just because it relates to a subject. I think value is similar. It is objective in the sense that the truth about value doesn't depend on the person making the judgment, but it's subjective, and of course it relates to subjects who experience things. And I think it would be very implausible to have a theory of value that didn't.
Yeah, you're talking about the table idea that you brought up, right? Well, Plato disagrees with you when he says that a chair has an intrinsic.
We'll come. You can obviously just corner him after the discussion. So I'm going to take one more question.
You can't call my name.
MashaAllah. I think you have been chosen by Uthman, actually. Yeah.
My question is in response to next is earlier you said that you wanted to sort of learn a little bit or be educated on what we believe is sort of the purpose for life for in general purpose of existence and whatnot. What is the biggest sort of confusion or thing that you think that you would like to understand from what Islam has to offer? Obviously, the studies whereby generally our ideas of death and whatnot, and these ideas of death help in a lot of psychological aspects. So there's anxiety and all those sorts of things. There's many things which Islam has, which we believe offers us, solace and ease of mind for us. What's the aspect of Islam or something which you might question or challenge for us, or something that you think is important to you to understand?
Oh, I feel like with only a couple of minutes left, it's maybe not the time for that question. I appreciate the question. It's a very good one. There's many things that I could bring up. Maybe I'll just mention one of them because the idea is that, well, in Islam, as I think in most theistic religions, that God created the universe and humanity in it. And I think there's usually an idea that he did so with a purpose. And that purpose, that God's created purpose, relates in some way, maybe it's not exactly the same, but it relates in some way to our purpose of life or our purpose in being here. And that's what I was hoping Uthman would maybe explain a bit more about his views about that, because I'm not assuming that all Muslims think exactly the same thing about this, just as not all atheists do. But I guess my question then is what was God's created purposes and how do those relate to our purposes here? Yeah, there's going to be different aspects to that question, but I'm not sure I have a clear idea about what that might be.
Thanks very much. We have to wrap up now, but naturally there's sometimes a capacity for you to come and continue the discussions, and inshallah that happens even amongst you guys if the guests have to leave. Just a quick kind of concluding note before I thank everyone. I think that in a lot of these discussions that happen, there's a very clear kind of back and forth centered around a particular principle, i.e. you'll have, does God exist, yes or no, why or why not. Tonight, I think we didn't really have that. It was a completely different discussion, and I believe a far more interesting and captivating one regarding meaning in a theistic context and meaning in a post-theistic or non-theistic context. And so we've had a comparison, more or less, of both the ideas and principles that drive meaning within these contexts. So if you take something out of it, please understand that it's not always going to be a very simple kind of back and forth, why not, he smashed him, bro, argument. So just to conclude with that, and thanks very much to both of our guests. I think it wasn't too bad. There were no tables thrown, as I think it was only the metaphysical hypothetical table. Yeah. Thanks very much to the organisers and to SUMSA and UNSW MSA as well. Oh, we have gifts. Nice.
I thought Abdullah was gonna.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. What is the name of the gift?
Will they bring me well-being and pleasure?
We really do appreciate that's coming down. I know that you have to fly down and everything. We had so many different troubles kind of making sure that the venue happened, but thankfully here we are. Did you put the Quran for G? You called him by his name this time. No, to be honest, I didn't know his name, that's why I was like, but it was 45. It's not malicious. I genuinely didn't catch his name. It's not on a photo. Thanks, guys.